So how do you solve the housing crisis? For the last few years, we've all heard the term flatten the curve in regards to COVID.
And it's working. It is flattening the curve.
Our rapidly changing behavior to flatten the curve.
The term flatten the curve comes from a 2007 paper prepared by U.S. health officials.
The same idea in terms of flattening the curve could be applied to the housing market and the housing crisis, and we would solve the problem. So you've heard it here first. I'm coining the phrase or robbing the phrase, flatten the curve, and applying it to the housing crisis. Over the last week, I've watched all of RT's primetime shows and read all their articles on the housing crisis. I was actually quite disappointed with the output from RTE. All it seemed to do was highlight the fact that there is a crisis. Everyone knows that. Also tried to set up divides between generations, and now they're suggesting that supply won't solve the problem and that there is some sort of debate going on that the law of supply and demand doesn't apply to housing. I'm not aware of that debate itself. I am aware that there's a few people in different fields of academics that don't quite understand it, but in terms of people who understand the law of supply and demand, there's no debate. The law of supply and demand is a theory, and that theory has been proven all over the world countless times, hence why it's called a law, similar to the law of gravity. The law of supply and demand is a simple theory. Generally speaking, as prices rise, supply will also rise. As demand falls, prices will fall. The law of supply and demand can be simply applied to something like grain. If prices go up because demand increases, supply will catch up with that increase in demand. The law of supply and demand can be applied to the housing market. However, the housing market is far more complex than a piece of grain. On the demand side, you will have lots of factors that are in play. One, you'll have the economic base of a particular area, perhaps a city. You'll also have to deal with people have the ability to choose between where they want to live in terms of different locations, different countries perhaps. Demand is heavily impacted by interest rates, access to capital, government control as well in terms of any incentives that they're providing or taxes that they're putting on property. Population growth is a huge factor as well as people's desire to be close to friends and family. On the supply side, supply can be impacted by the cost of construction, the cost of labour, as well as land policies and planning policies, the cost of materials and how easy it is to get materials, design standards as well. All these things impact the supply side, as well as government taxes and any levies that they want to put on development. Access to development funding plays a huge part in the supply side of new housing. You also have to look at the physical conditions of the land or an area in terms of soil conditions, ground conditions, as well as access to services within a particular location. One of the major factors impacting supply is the fact that it takes a long time to deliver new housing, as well as land is a limited resource. There are some very important characteristics that are applied to housing that are not applied to your standard good. Every property is immovable. You cannot just pick up some vacant properties in Leitrim and move them to Dublin. You could pick up a bag of grain and move to Dublin fairly easy, but you can't pick up a property. Every home is unique in its own regards and will have different characteristics, and those different characteristics may play a part in regards to the level of demand for that particular property. These are just some of the elements that can impact housing. All of them can be applied to the supply and demand curve if you understand them. So let's have a look to see how these factors can actually impact the supply and demand curve. Okay, simple supply and demand curve. First off, you have your price. Let's have it 1 million at the top. It will be 0 at the bottom. You also have your quantity line here. So let's say 0 people down here, and we'll have 1 million, or we'll have 1 million people living or wanting to live in a particular area in a city or wherever we're talking about. Then we'll add our supply line. So supply will start down here in the bottom and move all the way up. Basically what it means is at 0, no houses are going to be constructed. No one can afford to build a house at 0. Therefore the line actually doesn't start at 0. It starts down here at the most easiest construction models and houses that can be constructed. As we go up, it gets more and more costly to supply houses. Perhaps some of the houses are up here are apartments, the complicated construction on bad soil conditions, brownfield sites. Down here you might have greenfield sites, easy construction, access to service. But as the price goes up, more and more will be able to be constructed. Then we add in our demand line. So basically what this line means is the number of people who will be able to pay at a certain price. So let's say here at 1 million, only a few people can afford, in terms of quantity of people, we can just say that there's only 100 people that can afford to buy a £1 million property. But as you move down the actual scale, let's put it here, let's say that's 100,000 people can afford something. Let's just say this is, for argument's sake, we'll just put this as half, and that is for 500,000. So someone in the middle right now can afford, this amount of people can afford to buy at 500,000, and that's where your market equilibrium is in terms of supply and demand. But let's just think about it. What happens if more demand happens within a particular area? Perhaps there could be a number of reasons for that. Perhaps there's more jobs in the area, more tech jobs have moved in, perhaps supply of capital is easier, more banks are lending at lower interest rates, therefore there's more people who can actually afford to get a mortgage, therefore demand increases. What actually happens? So basically what happens is the demand line will shift out. So it will shift out this direction because there is more demand. And what happens then? So basically, because there's more demand, it means prices have increased. So let's say they've gone up to 600,000. What it also means is more supply can actually happen. Let's say another 50,000 units can be added at this point because of the fact that more prices have gone up, and perhaps sites that were difficult to build or complicated to build, they weren't feasible to be built at this stage, are now feasible to be built now because demand and price has gone up. But also think about it in a scenario where demand for a particular area falls. What happens to the demand line in that case? So basically what will happen to the demand line in that case is it shifts downwards. And you'll see what will happen to price. So now you have your new market equilibrium here. So let's say prices fall to 400,000. What it means though for supply is less supply will come onto the market. Let's say 70,000 are possible at that point in time. But basically what it means is because the price for homes, in terms of demand price for homes, has fallen, less new constructions can take place because they're not feasible anymore. So therefore less new homes can come onto the market. So that's a simple explanation in terms of what might happen if demand goes up or demand goes down. I think most people understand that concept in terms of if there is more demand, prices will go up. But let's look at it from a supply point of view. But what happens if you actually change the supply line for whatever reason? Perhaps it gets more complicated to build, planning laws get harder, or perhaps construction prices go up. What actually happens to the supply line at that stage? So what happens to the supply line at that stage is perhaps the supply line is shifted up, which actually impacts the amount of properties that can be brought onto the market. So basically what happens here is you now have a new market equilibrium at this point here. As we've shifted up this direction, it means that there's less properties that are going to be available to be built at this price point, because we're at this price point, even though the price has gone up, it actually means that less houses are going to be developed out because the cost of delivering those homes have shifted upwards, or there's something on the supply line that has forced it this direction. And that's kind of what has happened a little bit in the past in terms of construction costs, labor costs, zoning, development plans. All these things have shifted the supply line up, so it's making it more costly to develop out. But what happens if you actually try and make it easier to supply new houses onto the market? Perhaps construction costs come down, labor costs come down, material costs come down, or perhaps design standards change to make it easier to build, or planning laws change to make it easier to build, or even funding becomes more available to property developers to develop out properties. What happens to the supply line in that case? Well, in that case, the supply line will shift down. And what happens on our original line, this was the original line that we were talking about, what happens in that case is that the supply line now starts here, and that's your new market equilibrium. So what will actually have happened, because the market has shifted downwards from a supply point of view, the market is actually able to supply far more homes at a lower price. And that is because the supply line has shifted out. So this brings me back to my original line within this video, flatten the curve, and why I think it's a good idea to rob that term from COVID in terms of flattening the curve. It's a way to solve the housing crisis. But before I get into that in any more detail, I want to show you how to apply the supply and demand curve to a market like Dublin. So we go back again to the simple concept of price up here, that's a million again, up here, zero down here. And we have our quantity here, let's say again, 1 million people want to live in a particular area. Let's say it's Dublin. We have our demand line, let's say we have our demand line which is going this direction. So basically, this is our demand line. Only a handful of people in terms of quantity can actually live in the city if they're paying 1 million. The further the price goes down in terms of the price coming down all the way here, more and more people will want to live in the city and more people will actually be able to afford to live in the city. Hence why the line goes this direction. You will note that I haven't put the line all the way to the bottom in terms of price, because there are a handful of people who will never actually be able to buy a house for whatever particular reasons, and those people need to be looked after by the government. This is an important part in terms of where the supply line goes when you apply it to somewhere like Dublin. So in terms of the supply line, how you illustrate the supply line when you apply it to a city like Dublin is an important factor to try to illustrate what I mean by flattening the curve. Dublin is a constrained city. I.e. what I mean by that, it's very hard to develop new housing because of planning laws, because of height restrictions, because of the number of old stock that's in the city. So it's defined as a constrained city, similar to London and lots of old historical cities around the world. It's constrained in terms of delivering new housing. So in terms of how you illustrate a constrained city on a supply and demand curve, this is how you do it. So you start down here, and remember the last time we were bringing our supply line out this direction. Well, in a constrained city like Dublin, where it's hard to develop new housing, your supply line will look more like this. So let me just kind of illustrate this. This is your equilibrium in terms of price and the number of units that are actually available to be developed at any particular point. Let's just say, for argument's sake, we're at 600,000 here in terms of the current equilibrium on price, and we are able to develop 100,000 units at that price. So let's just assume that's our supply line. What happens if demand in that particular area, in demand in Dublin, increases? Again, remember, if demand increases, the actual demand line shifts up. So let's just illustrate that. So the demand line will shift up, as I mentioned. It will shift up. So it's gone this direction, demand has gone up. So what does that happen? We have a new market equilibrium. So basically, let's just say that is at 700,000 now. But look what has happened in terms of the actual supply of new housing. Even though the demand or the price has gone up by 100,000 and there's a decent gap there between these two, the actual size of the gap between the supply element hasn't changed a huge amount. So let's just say at that price, only 120,000 can be delivered from a feasibility point of view. So what has happened is the demand curve has shifted out. However, the ability to supply a huge amount more hasn't actually changed a huge amount because it is a constrained city. So let me just show you what would happen to a city that didn't have a constrained supply line. So again, we have our normal price, we have our normal quantity. So let's just assume you have your demand line, a standard demand line in terms of who would want to live in that city and at the price that they want to live at that city. And let's now assume that this is a city that is not constrained, i.e. somewhere like in some city in Texas that have pretty liberal planning and pretty liberal design standards and development standards, and it makes it easier to develop new housing quickly and fast. The supply line in a city like that, what it will actually look like, will start down here, and rather than it will go something like that. So if you can remember what Dublin looked like, Dublin's line was going up this direction because it was a constrained city. This is perhaps a city that makes it easier for you to develop new homes. So what happens there? In this regard, we have our market equilibrium here. Let's say that is 500,000 people or 500,000 units can be delivered at this particular price. Let's just say 400,000. Right, let's just say we have a scenario where people want to move to this city. A lot of people leaving California want to move to Texas, and they leave and they want to move to this city. What happens? Demand goes up because more people want to move there, right? So let's look at this again. We have our new market equilibrium because more people are going there. Because more people are going there, price has slightly increased. So therefore the price has perhaps gone up to 420,000. Over a year, and demand has gone up, the demand curve has shifted out. But let's look, this is the important part, let's look what happened to the supply line and the market equilibrium supply. So even though price has only shifted up a small amount, but because supply is not constrained in terms of its delivery and can deliver quickly and fast, what has happened? Perhaps maybe now 750,000 units can now be developed and delivered at a small price increase because they become feasible. So that is what I'm talking about in terms of trying to flatten the curve. So let's have a look at Dublin. So let's imagine we brought Dublin back, and what I'm talking about in terms of flattening the curve, ideally what I want to do is bring this curve down here and flatten it out. So what you want to do is bring the curve, originally was here, and you want to start bringing it down here. So you want to shift this curve down here all the time. You want to find reasons to move it down. Anything that will move this curve down and flatten it out is a good thing for Dublin. So what are the ideas that you can flatten this curve out in terms of supply? Basically, you have to make it easier to supply new homes into the market from a planning point of view, from a construction point of view, from a design point of view. Anything that you can find in terms of flattening out this curve to bring down the supply line and make it more flat will actually solve the housing crisis in Dublin. And you can actually do this as well in terms of right now, perhaps we're looking, this is where the market is right now, and the only things that are being developed right now from a construction point of view are build to rent accommodation, because they're the only ones, they're perhaps the only ones that are here that are able to actually pay these prices for these new homes, and the rest of the market is being shut out. But you don't necessarily have to change that. Perhaps you keep the model that's there and funding models that are there. Let that happen. Let that continuously happen in terms of build to rent, and your build to rent supply line can be similar to this. But perhaps you want to look at individual types of properties, i.e. you want owner-occupier properties, or you want apartments for people to live in rather than be for build to rent. Perhaps to shift those lines down, more and more incentive is needed to reduce the cost of supply of those. So perhaps reduce the build cost, reduce the taxes on it, or even reduce the design standards on it. Anything that will shift it downwards, but all the design standards and everything else and taxes can remain the same for build to rent because they're able to supply at that level. But you cannot supply normal housing stock or normal apartments at the current level that they're at the moment. Demand in terms of the price is just not there, and you need to shift it down. And look what happens to prices in Dublin if you actually manage to do that. So if you manage to bring this curve down, you have your new market equilibrium over here, which means far more people are actually able to live and afford to live in the city, and the price will have come down as well. So this is what I mean by flattening the curve, and how flattening the curve is how you solve the housing crisis. I hope you liked this video. I put a bit of effort into it. Please show your support by giving it a like. Sharing the video with your friends is a huge benefit to me and help grows this channel. So please feel free to do that. And also, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please subscribe to the channel as well. So if you ever hear anyone else referring to flatten the curve in terms of solving the housing crisis, you heard it here first. I coined it. I'm claiming it. As always, thanks for watching.